Today, I want to talk about something that most people associate with aesthetics or physical strength, but that is actually deeply connected to brain health, longevity, and cognitive resilience. That is muscle. When people think about protecting their brain, they often think about puzzles or supplements, medications, or memory exercises. While those things have value, one of the most powerful tools that we have for protecting brain function is something far more fundamental. It's maintaining and building muscle. Muscle is considered the organ of longevity. So, muscle is not simply tissue that helps us move, it is metabolically active. It's communicating with the brain. It regulates hormones. It influences inflammation and directly affects cognitive performance and long-term neurological health. And understanding this relationship changes how we think about exercise entirely because resistance training stops being just about fitness and becomes part of brain care. So let's talk about the brain-body connection a little bit more in detail. For many years, medicine treated the brain and body as separate systems. Neurology focused on cognition and mental health, while exercise science focused on strength and conditioning and physical performance. Modern research has changed that view dramatically. We now understand that the brain is deeply influenced by signals coming from muscles, metabolism, and the immune system. Movement is not just something the brain controls. It is something that feeds back into the brain, shaping how it functions. So when muscles contract during resistance training, they release signaling molecules called myokines. And these molecules act like messengers traveling through the bloodstream and influencing processes throughout the body, including brain function. And one of the most important effects of this communication is the stimulation of neuroprotective factors that support brain health. So let's go a little bit deeper into that. A key molecule in this conversation is BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. BDNF is often described as fertilizer for the brain because it actually supports the survival of neurons. It strengthens the synaptic connections, and it really helps the brain to adapt to new information and stress. Higher levels of BDNF are associated with improved learning, memory, mood regulation, and resilience against neurodegenerative diseases. So resistance training has been shown to increase BDNF production, and particularly when workouts challenge muscle tissue enough to stimulate adaptation, more BDNF is produced. And that means that strength training is not only building muscle fibers, but it's actively supporting neural networks and cognitive function. So when people say exercise is good for the brain, they are often referring to aerobic activity. So what is less widely discussed is that resistance training actually provides its own unique neurological benefits, particularly through its impact on metabolic health and hormonal signaling. So again, muscle, let's talk about it in terms of it being a metabolic organ. So another reason then that muscle matters for brain health is its role in regulating metabolism. Muscle tissue is one of the primary sites where glucose is stored and utilized. And so when muscle mass is lower or insulin sensitivity decreases, blood sugar regulation becomes less efficient. And over time, this contributes to insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is not only a metabolic issue, it's increasingly recognized as a major risk for cognitive decline and neurodegenerative diseases. And some researchers even refer to Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes. Why? Because of the strong relationship between impaired glucose metabolism and brain dysfunction. So by improving insulin sensitivity, resistance training helps stabilize energy available to the brain. So stable mood sugar supports clearer thinking and more consistent mood and improved executive function. This is one reason individuals often report improved mental clarity when they begin strength training regularly. Let's pivot and talk about inflammation and aging. So chronic low-grade inflammation is really one of the primary drivers of aging and cognitive decline. Muscle plays a very surprising role in actually regulating inflammation. Increased muscle mass and regular resistance training actually reduces inflammatory markers and it improves immune signaling. Now, that matters because chronic inflammation affects the brain's ability to communicate internally. It contributes to fatigue, brain fog, reduced motivation, and increased risk for depression. And so, when muscle health improves, inflammatory burden often decreases, and that creates a more stable biological environment for brain function. And so, in this sense, muscle is not just about strength, it's about the body's anti aging capacity or strategy. Okay, let's pivot and talk a little bit about hormones and neurotransmitters. Resistance training definitely influences hormonal balance, which has downstream effects on the brain and health. Strength training can definitely improve testosterone regulation, growth hormone release, and overall metabolic signaling. These hormones influence mood, motivation, and cognitive performance. And additionally, exercise supports neurotransmitter systems such as dopamine and serotonin, which are very essential in terms of our focus and in terms of reward processing and even emotional regulation. So many people assume that mood improvement from exercise comes only from endorphins, right? But the reality is way more complex than that. Resistance training actually reshapes the entire biological environment that supports emotional stability and cognitive resilience. So let's talk about muscle loss and its association with cognitive risk. So as we age, muscle mass naturally declines unless it's actively maintained. And this process is called sarcopenia. And it is associated not only with physical frailty, but also with increased risk of cognitive impairment. Research consistently shows that individuals with higher muscle strength and better physical function tend to maintain cognitive performance much longer. Now, this does not mean muscle alone prevents cognitive decline, but it is part of a broader network of protective factors. Muscle supports metabolism, metabolism supports brain energy, and brain energy supports cognitive performance. So, one of the overlooked aspects of strength training is the neurological demand that is involved. So, complex movements require coordination, balance, and motor learning. And the brain has to recruit specific muscle fibers, adjust movement patterns, and adapt to change in loads. So, this process strengthens neural pathways associated with movement planning and execution. And in many ways, lifting weights is also training the nervous system, right? The brain is constantly learning how to move more efficiently, which strengthens communication between brain regions responsible for coordination and decision making. So, let's talk about just some practical takeaways of what we're trying to discuss today. In terms of brain health, resistance training does not need to be extreme or overly complicated. Again, we've talked about this in previous episodes, but consistency matters more than intensity. It's the little things that you do every day that add up to big results. And training major muscle groups 2 or 3 times per week actually can provide some meaningful benefits. And prioritizing compound movements like squats or deadlifts or presses and pulls engages large muscle groups and stimulates broader metabolic and neurological responses. So, having said that, it's important to understand that recovery is equally important, right? So, sleep, nutrition, adequate protein intake support both muscle repair and brain function. So, the goal, as always, is not perfection or competition. The goal is building a resilient biological foundation. And so perhaps the most important shift is just recognizing that muscle is not simply about appearance or athletic performance. Muscle is protective. It supports metabolic stability, hormonal balance, inflammation control, and cognitive resilience. In a culture that often separates physical health from mental health, understanding the connection between muscle and brain function allows us to maybe take a more integrated approach to longevity. Strength training becomes less about changing how you look and more about supporting how you think, feel, and age. Thanks for spending time with me again this week.
This podcast is for general informational and inspirational purposes and does not constitute the practice of medicine or any healthcare services. No doctor-patient relationship is established, and the content in these episodes is not intended to diagnose, treat, or give medical advice, nor is this a substitute for seeking professional medical care. The use of the information discussed is at the user's own risk.